Devil's Island was never meant to rehabilitate. It was designed to erase. Off the coast of French Guiana, where the Atlantic meets dense equatorial forest, the French state built an institution whose purpose was not correction but removal. Known collectively as the penal colony of the Isles du Salut, and most infamously as Devil's Island, this was a place engineered to make people disappear without the spectacle of execution. No firing squads. No public gallows. Just distance, disease, isolation, and time. To understand why this place existed, you have to understand France in the mid-19th century. The country was emerging from decades of upheaval, revolutions, regime changes, social unrest, and rising urban crime. Industrialization had pulled massive populations into cities, overwhelming policing systems and prisons alike. Paris, Marseille, Lyon, these cities were seen by lawmakers as breeding grounds for repeat offenders, political agitators, and men deemed beyond reform. France's prisons were full. Transportation, not incarceration, became the solution. The idea was not new. Britain had shipped convicts to Australia. Spain used remote colonies. For France, the overseas empire offered a convenient answer. French Guiana was distant, inhospitable, and already under colonial control. It was portrayed to the public as a tropical land of opportunity, but privately understood by administrators as a natural barrier of jungle, heat, and disease. In 1852, under Napoleon III, transportation became official policy. Convicts sentenced to hard labor would not serve time in France. They would be sent across the ocean. Not temporarily, but permanently. Even after completing their sentence, most were required to remain in the colony under a system called doublage, effectively doubling their punishment through forced settlement. Devil's Island was the sharpest edge of that system. It was never intended to house the average criminal. Thieves, forgers, and low-level offenders were processed through mainland camps along the Guianese coast. Devil's Island itself, small, rocky, battered by waves, was reserved for a specific category of inmate, those considered dangerous to the state, disruptive to order, or symbolically threatening. Political prisoners. Notorious repeat offenders. Men whose very presence in France was seen as destabilizing. This was exile, formalized and industrialized. The French government sold the penal colony to the public as a rational response to crime. Criminals would be removed from society. Colonization would be advanced through forced labor. Order would be restored at home. On paper, it was efficient. In practice, it was lethal. The climate alone was enough to break most men. Temperatures hovered in oppressive humidity. Tropical diseases, malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, were endemic. Medical care was minimal, sanitation primitive. Death rates were not hidden from administrators, they were factored in. But Devil's Island went further. Its isolation was absolute. Separated from the mainland by dangerous currents, surrounded by sharks, and battered by unpredictable seas, escape was less a possibility than a fantasy. The island itself became a natural executioner, requiring no guards to pull a trigger. This was deliberate. French officials understood that punishment worked best when it inspired fear. Devil's Island became a name whispered in courtrooms and police stations, a threat that required no explanation. Judges did not need to describe it in detail. The name alone carried weight. For the public, it existed at a distance, both geographic and psychological. Out of sight, out of mind. For the state, it was a pressure valve, releasing what it defined as dangerous human excess into an environment designed to consume it. The institution also served a symbolic purpose. It reinforced the authority of the state at a time when political dissent was rising across Europe. Sending enemies of order to a place from which return was unlikely sent a message: opposition did not end in imprisonment. It ended in disappearance. This logic became most visible during periods of political instability. After uprisings, coups, and scandals, Devil's Island absorbed individuals whose continued existence within France posed embarrassment or threat. The most famous case would later expose the moral rot at the heart of the system, but the institution itself did not depend on any single injustice. It was built to function regardless of individual guilt or innocence. That is the critical distinction. Devil's Island was not a response to a crime. It was a response to fear. Fear of overcrowded cities. Fear of revolution. Fear of men who could not be controlled through ordinary means. Fear that punishment within sight of the public was no longer enough. By exporting punishment, France exported responsibility. Once a man boarded a transport ship bound for Guyana, his fate largely ceased to matter. Records became sparse. Deaths were expected. Survival was incidental. The island's design, administration, and location all flowed from this philosophy. It did not need to be humane. It needed to be final. What emerged was not merely a prison, but a mechanism of state power stripped of sentiment. A place where the line between punishment and annihilation blurred, and where nature itself was conscripted as part of the sentence. Devil's Island existed because France wanted a solution that did not require reform, oversight, or mercy. It was a monument to control through distance. A warning written in geography rather than law. And once created, it took on a life of its own. The institution would operate for over a century. Tens of thousands would pass through the penal system of French Guiana. Few would return. Fewer still would return unchanged. This chapter is not about what happened to any single man. It is about why a modern state decided that some people should not merely be punished, but removed from the world entirely. And why it believed the sea would do the rest. Devil's Island did not rely on walls alone. Its architecture was a collaboration between human design and environmental hostility, a prison where the landscape itself functioned as a security system. Unlike continental penitentiaries built upward with tiers, corridors, and watchtowers, Devil's Island was defined by separation. Separation from the mainland. Separation from oversight. Separation from the idea that a prison must be escapable in theory, even if not in practice. Here, escape was designed to fail before it was attempted. The island is small, uneven, and volcanic, its perimeter defined by sharp rock faces rather than beaches. There is no gradual shoreline, no forgiving sand. The Atlantic strikes directly against stone, creating powerful currents that pull outward, away from land. Even strong swimmers would be disoriented within minutes. Sharks were not a myth propagated for fear, they were an ecological reality. This geography was not incidental. It was the foundation. Buildings were placed to exploit the island's contours. Prison structures hugged the higher ground, keeping inmates exposed to wind, rain, and sun while maintaining clear lines of sight. There was no need for towering walls when the sea functioned as an unbroken perimeter. The water replaced fences. Distance replaced locks. Cells were small, stark, and deliberately uncomfortable. Thick stone walls absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, creating an environment where sleep was shallow and restless. Ventilation was minimal, achieved through narrow barred openings that admitted air but little light. From many cells, the ocean was visible, a calculated cruelty. Freedom was always in sight, never reachable. The layout discouraged congregation. Unlike later prisons designed around centralized yards, Devil's Island fragmented movement. Prisoners were confined to individual cells for long periods, released only under strict supervision. Any outdoor access was tightly controlled, brief, and exposed. There were no shaded communal spaces where men could gather unnoticed. Every movement occurred in open sight, against bare ground or stone. Surveillance did not depend on advanced technology. It depended on predictability. Guards were positioned at elevated points, not to dominate through presence, but to observe through routine. Inmates learned quickly that deviation, pausing too long, turning unexpectedly, lingering near another prisoner, invited immediate punishment. Control was achieved not through constant violence, but through certainty. Isolation was the primary method. On Devil's Island, isolation was not a special sanction, it was the default condition. Prisoners spent most of their existence alone, their contact with others limited to shouted exchanges carried by wind or brief, monitored encounters during work assignments. This eroded solidarity. It prevented collective resistance. It reduced men to individual problems, easier to manage and easier to break. Even when prisoners were transferred to the mainland camps of French Guiana, Devil's Island remained the psychological apex of the system. It was the place guards referenced, the ultimate destination for those deemed unmanageable. The architecture of control extended beyond the island itself, it shaped behavior across the entire penal colony. Escape prevention relied on layers rather than barriers. First, the island. Second, the sea. Third, the jungle beyond the mainland, dense, disorienting, and lethal to the unprepared. Fourth, the policy of doublage, which ensured that even successful escape from confinement did not equate to freedom. A man who survived the island still belonged to the colony. Movement within the prison was intentionally exhausting. Paths between cells, work areas, and administrative buildings were exposed to sun and rain, with no shelter beyond bare overhangs. Physical fatigue compounded psychological stress. Discipline became easier when bodies were already weakened. The absence of privacy was absolute. Cells offered no concealment. Sanitation occurred in full view. Illness unfolded publicly. Death did not interrupt routine. Bodies were removed, cells reassigned, schedules maintained. The architecture absorbed loss without adjustment. Administrative spaces were austere and detached. Records were kept with bureaucratic precision, but human presence was minimal. Decisions about confinement, transfer, or punishment were made far from the cells themselves. This separation insulated administrators from consequence. The prison functioned as a machine whose operators rarely witnessed its effects directly. There were no rehabilitation facilities because rehabilitation was never the objective. No workshops designed for skill building, no classrooms, no chapels intended for reflection. Labor, when required, served maintenance and punishment rather than development. The architecture reflected this absence. Every structure communicated permanence, not progress. Even sound was controlled. Wind and surf dominated the acoustic environment, drowning out conversation and making coordination difficult. Shouted words dissolved into noise. Silence was enforced not by rule, but by futility. At night, darkness returned control to the guards. Minimal lighting preserved visibility where necessary while leaving most areas in shadow. Prisoners learned to remain still, conserving energy, waiting for morning heat to restart the cycle. Time lost structure. Days blurred. Architecture became a psychological instrument, reshaping perception itself. What made Devil's Island distinct was not brutality in isolation, but efficiency. The system did not require constant intervention. Once established, it ran on inertia. Nature, routine, and design did most of the work. This was not accidental cruelty. It was planned minimalism. The fewest resources used to achieve the greatest control. The result was a prison where escape was not just unlikely, but irrational. Attempts meant confronting the sea, the jungle, and a system that assumed failure as the default outcome. The architecture did not challenge men to test its limits. It informed them, quietly and continuously, that resistance was pointless. In this environment, power did not announce itself. It settled into stone, water, and repetition. The prison did not need to remind inmates where they were. The island did that for them. Devil's Island was not filled by accident. Every man sent there arrived as the result of a decision, sometimes judicial, sometimes political, often administrative, made far from the island itself. What united the inmates was not the nature of their crimes, but the conclusion reached by the state, that ordinary imprisonment was insufficient. This was a place reserved for those defined as unmanageable. Within the broader French Guiana penal system, prisoners were sorted continuously. Most convicts labored on the mainland, building roads, clearing jungle, maintaining colonial infrastructure. Devil's Island existed above that hierarchy, a terminal classification for men whose presence elsewhere threatened order, authority, or embarrassment. Political prisoners formed one of the most consequential categories. These were men convicted not merely of illegal acts, but of symbolic danger. Journalists, activists, military officers, and alleged traitors were sent here when their continued visibility in France risked destabilizing public trust. Their confinement was meant to be invisible, their influence extinguished through distance. They were often well educated, articulate, and acutely aware of what had been taken from them. That awareness made them difficult to manage. On Devil's Island, isolation neutralized intellect as effectively as chains once neutralized bodies. Repeat offenders constituted another core population. These were men the courts labeled incorrigible, individuals with long criminal records, resistant to discipline, unresponsive to prior sentences. In the logic of the penal colony, recidivism was not a failure of the system, but proof that harsher removal was justified. Violent criminals were present, but violence alone was not the qualifying trait. Many murderers served sentences elsewhere. Devil's Island was for those whose behavior threatened the internal stability of other camps, men who organized resistance, attacked guards, or undermined authority through influence rather than brute force. This distinction matters. Devil's Island was not designed to hold the most physically dangerous inmates. It was designed to hold the most disruptive ones. Security classifications were informal but rigid. Prisoners arrived already labeled. Once assigned to the island, reclassification was rare. Good behavior did not result in transfer. Compliance did not shorten sentences. The logic was fixed: if a man had been sent here, the system assumed he would remain a problem indefinitely. Psychologically, this assumption shaped everything. Many inmates arrived already fractured by transport. The voyage from France took weeks under appalling conditions. Chains, disease, overcrowding, and uncertainty stripped men of identity before they ever saw the island. By the time they disembarked, they were physically weakened and mentally destabilized, ideal conditions for institutional control. What separated Devil's Island inmates from ordinary prisoners was not just their crimes, but their perceived threat to narrative. These were men whose stories, if told freely, might challenge the legitimacy of the state. Isolation silenced them without spectacle. The population was overwhelmingly male, predominantly French, though colonial subjects were also present. Social backgrounds varied widely. Some had grown up in extreme poverty. Others had lived lives of privilege before falling into disgrace. On the island, those distinctions eroded quickly. Uniform deprivation replaced class identity. Psychological profiles converged over time. Initial anger gave way to resignation. Hope narrowed. Men learned not to plan. Planning implied a future. On Devil's Island, the future was abstract and unreliable. Those who resisted psychologically, who maintained routines, intellectual exercises, or private rituals, often suffered more intensely. Awareness prolonged pain. Those who survived longest were frequently those who learned to shrink their inner world, reducing expectation to the next meal, the next hour, the next sunrise. Mental illness was common and untreated. Depression, paranoia, hallucinations, and emotional withdrawal flourished in isolation. The institution did not diagnose. It observed. A prisoner's psychological deterioration was recorded only when it interfered with discipline. There was no meaningful distinction between punishment and existence. Every aspect of daily life reinforced subjugation. Identity was replaced by number, history by routine. Men ceased to be offenders serving sentences and became components in a system designed to function without regard to outcome. What made these inmates fundamentally different from ordinary prisoners was permanence. Even after sentences ended, many were not allowed to return to France. The policy of forced settlement ensured that the punishment extended beyond confinement. Freedom, when granted, was conditional and hollow. This knowledge altered behavior. Without the prospect of return, motivation collapsed. Rehabilitation lost meaning. Obedience became a survival strategy, not a path to release. Guards understood this dynamic. They did not see the island's inmates as men temporarily removed from society. They saw them as finished cases. This perception shaped interactions, minimal, procedural, emotionally distant. Violence was unnecessary when indifference sufficed. Occasionally, new arrivals disrupted this equilibrium. Men who arrived still believing in appeal, justice, or rescue created tension. Their refusal to accept invisibility unsettled both guards and fellow prisoners. Over time, the island corrected this resistance through monotony rather than force. There were no heroes here. No archetypal villains. Only individuals reduced to classifications and then stripped of even that. Devil's Island did not select for remorse or redemption. It selected for exclusion. Those sent here were not meant to be understood, corrected, or reintegrated. They were meant to be contained until relevance expired, whether through death, mental collapse, or administrative forgetting. The institution did not ask who these men were. It asked only whether the world would function more smoothly without them. And once the answer was yes, the island ensured the question would never be asked again. Life on Devil's Island was not structured to be lived. It was structured to be endured. From the moment a prisoner woke, the institution asserted itself through repetition. There were no alarms in the modern sense, no bells designed to regulate time with precision. Instead, the day began with light, harsh, unfiltered tropical daylight forcing its way through barred openings. Heat arrived early and stayed without apology. Sleep ended not because it was finished, but because the environment refused to sustain it. Cells were unlocked according to schedule, not need. Movement followed routine rather than purpose. Prisoners learned quickly that initiative was dangerous. To act without instruction was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny often led to punishment. Survival depended on passivity. Silence governed everything. Conversation was not formally forbidden, but it was functionally impossible. Distance between inmates, constant supervision, and environmental noise made sustained communication futile. Words carried poorly over wind and surf. What did carry was exhaustion. Men conserved energy by speaking less, moving less, expecting less. Meals arrived predictably and without ceremony. Food was minimal, repetitive, and nutritionally inadequate. Rice, beans, thin broth, occasional protein of questionable quality. Hunger was constant but controlled. Starvation weakened resistance without triggering collapse. This balance was intentional. Eating was a solitary act. There were no communal tables, no shared rituals. Food reinforced isolation rather than alleviating it. Even nourishment became another reminder that existence here was transactional, calories exchanged for compliance. Work, when assigned, was not rehabilitative. It was functional. Maintenance of the island's infrastructure. Clearing debris. Repairing paths. Tasks chosen not for skill building, but for their capacity to exhaust. Labor occurred under direct supervision, with little verbal interaction. Guards watched posture and pace more than productivity. Punishment was subtle and relentless. There were no dramatic spectacles. No public beatings designed to terrorize through example. Discipline was bureaucratic. A delayed meal. Reduced outdoor time. Transfer to a more exposed cell. Prolonged isolation beyond the already isolating baseline. The absence of relief was itself a punishment. Solitary confinement, when imposed, differed only in degree, not kind. A man already alone was made more alone. Time stretched. Sensory deprivation intensified. Thoughts turned inward and then against themselves. Guards understood this progression and rarely intervened unless behavior became disruptive. Medical care existed nominally. In practice, it functioned as triage. Those who could work were kept working. Those who could not were recorded, observed, and often left untreated. Illness was common. Recovery was not assumed. Death did not disrupt operations. Bodies deteriorated in predictable ways. Muscle mass declined. Skin infections spread. Eyes dulled from lack of variation and stimulation. The heat dehydrated. The humidity inflamed wounds. Small injuries became chronic conditions. Mental deterioration was less visible but more pervasive. Men lost track of time. Weeks blurred into months. Sentences lost meaning when the future held no clear endpoint. Even those who knew their release date struggled to conceptualize life beyond the island. The institution colonized imagination as effectively as it colonized land. Some inmates attempted to impose order on themselves. Silent routines. Counting steps. Memorizing texts recalled from memory. These strategies offered temporary stability, but they also underscored absence. The absence of choice. The absence of novelty. The absence of human connection. Others withdrew completely. Emotional flattening became a defense mechanism. Guards recognized this state as compliance. A man who felt nothing caused fewer problems. From the guard's perspective, life inside required emotional discipline of a different kind. Assignments to Devil's Island were not sought after. Isolation affected staff as well, though power insulated them from its worst effects. Guards lived with the same climate, the same remoteness, the same limited contact with the outside world. Their authority compensated for deprivation, but it did not eliminate it. Professional distance was encouraged. Personal engagement with inmates was discouraged. Familiarity was seen as a liability. Guards learned to interact through procedure, not empathy. Orders were given briefly. Responses were expected without discussion. This distance reduced conflict. It also reduced accountability. Guards measured success by stability. No escape attempts. No organized resistance. No disruptions to routine. The absence of incidents signaled effective control. Suffering, so long as it remained quiet, did not register as failure. Night offered no relief. Darkness intensified isolation. Minimal lighting preserved security while denying comfort. The sound of the ocean grew louder after sunset, a constant reminder of separation. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by heat, insects, and intrusive thoughts. There were moments of acute crisis. Mental breakdowns. Acts of self-harm. Occasional violence. These incidents were contained quickly and quietly. Records were updated. Procedures adjusted. The system absorbed shock without reflection. What made life inside Devil's Island distinct was not cruelty alone, but monotony. Endless sameness eroded identity more thoroughly than pain ever could. Men did not remember specific days. They remembered sensations: heat, hunger, fatigue, waiting. Waiting became the central activity. Waiting for meals. Waiting for movement. Waiting for illness to pass or worsen. Waiting for release that might never come. Time ceased to be something spent and became something endured. There was no narrative arc within the prison. No progression from intake to improvement. No milestones beyond survival. The institution offered no story in which inmates could locate themselves. Without narrative, meaning dissolved. This was the prison's greatest power. By stripping life down to routine without purpose, Devil's Island transformed punishment into environment. The prison did not need to act upon inmates continuously. It simply existed around them, shaping behavior through presence alone. Guards rotated. Administrators changed. Policies shifted incrementally. The experience of confinement remained consistent. Men entered as individuals. They adapted or they broke. The institution did not adjust either way. Life inside Devil's Island was not defined by what happened, but by what never did. No progress. No relief. No return. Just days accumulating without direction, until even the concept of days lost relevance. And in that suspended state, the prison achieved exactly what it was designed to do.